Thank you, everybody. First, I'd like to say that before I begin, it is truly an honor to be invited to speak in such a prestigious lecture series that has had so many incredible scholars that I myself have referenced repeatedly in my own works. And when I saw that I was given the invitation to speak here for you guys, I didn't know what to think. I was so ecstatically happy. It was just, I was out of my mind. I called my wife. She's currently in the United States right now, doing some paperwork, and I just told her how excited I was, and I was really looking forward to this event. And I once again thank you for being here. I know it's Saturday, and I know it's hot. It's mid-July, but may Allah reward you for coming to see this presentation today. So, without any further ado, I think that was a really nice introduction. I appreciate it, and so I don't need to talk about myself anymore. I can get right to the book here. So, as you see, this is the cover of the book, Islam, Liberalism, Ontology, Critical Reevaluation. For those of you wondering, the picture on the cover is actually a picture of my wife. I took this picture of her while we were in the famous Nasr al-Mulk Masjid in Shiraz. And this was, I think, on our honeymoon, actually, when we visited her home country. She's from Iran. So that's a little background about why I chose that picture. And, it's a picture we both like, and she really likes it too. So, okay. Well, let's talk about the book. Let's talk about what's going on here, because I hope I can quickly clarify any potential misunderstandings of what I'm doing here. Thing I want to make clear is this is a technical engagement with liberalism. Okay, so this book is not me talking about liberalism's bad, liberalism's evil, it's kufar. That's not what we're doing in this book. This book is really a technical academic effort meant to show where the actual compatibilities and incompatibilities between Islam and liberalism as discourses more broadly construed lie. Okay, so I do the best I can in this book. I make an explicit point to avoid being polemical. I know there's other recent works on this topic that are far more polemical than this, but I explicitly wanted to avoid polemics as much as possible. And at least in the introduction chapters, and of course in the conclusion, we always have our point we try to make. But I think the first, the first 8 chapters are pretty straightforward, and I don't think, hopefully, inshallah, nobody would accuse me of trying to be overly polemical here, right? So the main argument being pushed forth throughout this manuscript is that liberalism, both enlightenment or political, and we'll talk more about that later, and Islam operate on fundamentally different baseline assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The stark differences regarding the overarching ontology of both discourses make reconciling them very problematic, in my opinion. Generalized lower order similarities between Islam and liberalism, I argue, should be seen as primarily incidental to, rather than indicative of, any genuinely deeper discursive congruence. This work also seeks to open the door to more serious scholarly inquiry regarding an alternative discursive framework, namely that which falls under the very broad umbrella of communitarianism, to help modern policymakers and theorists frame future social and political debates that potentially will transpire in Muslim majority countries, especially those transitioning out of autocracy or civil war. Please, I'd like to point out here also, communitarianism and communism, not the same thing, okay? So a couple people have already asked me, you advocating for communism? No, of course not. So we'll talk about what that means when I get to that section, okay? We're talking about communitarianism in the Michael Sandel, Alistair McIntyre kind of sense. So for those who are familiar with this topic, okay? So arguing that Islam and liberalism are not reconcilable at a higher order level is not necessarily a contentious claim to make, okay? This work is not trying to sell itself as offering any kind of controversial and a radically new argument on this matter. Other scholars have made this basic point before, even though more recently, as I noted in the introduction of the book, some scholars have sought to challenge this position. The provocative Bernard Lewis, frankly, yet reasonably argued, in my opinion, that the question is not, quote, whether liberal democracy is compatible with Islamic fundamentalism. Clearly it is not, but rather is it whether it is compatible with Islam itself. He further notes that, quote, liberal democracy, however far it may have traveled, however much it may have been transformed, in its origins is a product of the West. Fair points. What differentiates this work from others that have alluded to Lewis's point, however, is that this particular project offers a rigorous critical analysis and what hopes to be a deep investigation of the basic categories and constructs that comprise Islam and liberalism as general discourses via a clearly defined methodological mode of inquiry. Rather than just making this basic point via a spattering of references and anecdotes, this book seeks to address in a meticulous and measured manner via primary and canonical sources that comprise each discourse of this topic. It ultimately hopes to serve as a useful asset for those studying comparative political theory or the relationship between international politics and religion. So the target audience for this book, because book publishers always want to hear this stuff when you write the proposal, is really for advanced undergrads and graduate students, right? But I also think I wrote this in a way that those who have a basic knowledge of Islam and a little bit of knowledge about liberalism and contemporary politics will hopefully be able to pick up this book and perhaps won't understand every single technical thing I'm discussing. I mean, when trying to understand Locke, even I don't know if I'm discussing it right sometimes, right? So, this stuff is not easy, but at the same time, I think many people should be able to read this book and hopefully get something out of it. And that's really should be the goal of any author who writes any book. Okay, so that's sort of the introduction of what the book is doing. So, the world of competing discourses for hegemony, at least in terms of being seen as the appropriate mode of political inquiry by policymakers, political actors, and academics alike, liberalism and anti-foundationalism, or what some call post-foundationalism, to varying degrees have all but won out in recent times. Fred Dallmeyer, one of my true intellectual heroes who I've had the honor to meet at Notre Dame a couple of times, postulates that political liberalism has achieved what he calls virtual canonical status, edging out nearly all other competing ideologies and perspectives. Similar to Fred Dallmeyer, Lucas Swain, more recently in 2018 argued that many liberals have grown complacent with their philosophical frameworks, even when confronted with the serious challenges from alternative approaches, which results in their being, quote, less likely to scrutinize or be receptive to improving the values and institutions that they affirm. Therefore, the canonization of political liberalism has a far greater reaching impact and implications than merely facilitating the preservation of the most obvious manifestations of imperialism and global domination. Once again, turning back to Dallmeyer, he says here, and I have it written on the slide, at this point, instead of preserving its elan, liberalism's original critique or mode of critical questioning is in danger of turning into a fixed answer or an unquestioned dogma itself. To put it another way, liberty is changing from a liberating promise into a vested status or privileged possession. Dallmeyer and Swain both seem to be suggesting that liberalism has in many ways become its own exclusive club. It's become an entrenched ideology, taken as a fully realized and perfected axiom in many ways, rather than merely another option or possibility for social organization. It has become, therefore, exactly what it was critical of in the first place: another iteration of unreflective deference to tradition, albeit a new one that has replaced earlier traditions. Previously, in my last book, I argued that a few doctrinal changes, or the abrogation of a few unsavory ayat of the Quran. Yes, hello? Somebody say something? I think somebody's microphone is okay, I'll continue. So previously I argued that in my opinion, the abrogation of a few ayat of the Quran that are maybe unsavory to the liberal palate are not enough to make society grounded in Islamic values compatible with liberal democracy, in my opinion. Stylistic changes to certain specific practices and beliefs are only the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion, when considering the deep incompatibilities between Islam and liberalism. The book here, therefore, will digs deeper into this iceberg by looking at the ideas, as I said before, of essential thinkers within both traditions. And I start off by spending more time with liberalism, and then I move more into the Islamic part. Okay. But before we get to that, I should speak briefly about the methodological approach to this book, because any good book should have some methodology undergirding its structure, right? You'll learn this when writing your dissertation for those of you grad students out there. So as I say in the introduction towards the end, this book aims to be a work of comparative political theory, and it draws heavily from Andrew March's earlier claims regarding what comparative political theory ought to aim for. According to March, at the heart of the comparative political theory enterprise is what he describes as quote-unquote principled value conflict, exploring its normative implications, in his words, is, quote, an appropriate task of engaged political theory and can be made the centerpiece of the comparative political theory project more generally. He describes comparative political theory as a justificatory exercise that differs from traditional concerns of hermeneutics, discourse analysis, genealogy, or intellectual history, to the extent that it is concerned with a particular form of normative argumentation or justification. For March, comparative political theory does not pretend to be disinterested or necessarily value neutral. and it is openly concerned with justifying certain normative principles from different philosophical, ethical, or religious foundations. Marx's own method of what he calls conjecture involves three fundamental premises that I tried to follow in this book when creating my arguments. One, arguing from the more orthodox sources first and then moving on to the less orthodox sources. Two, engaging in transparency and restraint when making arguments or claims. And three, showing and perhaps most importantly of all, showing sympathy for the text in question being analyzed, which basically means reading the text as the way the authors themselves would want you to read it, right? So it means doing justice to the text, trying to read it in the most fair-minded way you can without letting your own biases, overly influence how you read it. And this is, of course, difficult to do, and this requires a lot of different readings, right? So if you want to try to come up with a discussion of John Locke, you have to read other commentaries on Locke's position to sort of figure out what the general consensus is. And you have to assume that other scholars probably have understood Locke better than you do, and then you probably can come to a greater conclusion after you've done enough investigations, right? So showing sympathy of the text is not necessarily as easy as it sounds, and it does require a little bit of technical expertise. Now, I tried to do this, and if I did, Allahu Alam, right? But I did the best I could, and I took this really seriously when structuring this book. So indeed, I find a great deal of merit with Marx's approach. It makes no sense to base one's arguments about liberalism or Islam on sources seen as widely or overly reformist or overly conservative for that matter, or outside the mainstream, right? So orthodoxy and extremism are not the same thing. We all know that, right? This often means first engaging, as I said, with generally the more traditional or conservative positions. This does not mean simply dismissing reformist or unorthodox positions, but it does mean recognizing that these positions ought not be the ones to articulate the more general ontological claims of a particular discourse. So, for example, I give this example when discussing, this is an extreme example, but it illustrates the point. So when discussing the theological and eschatological foundations of Judaism, for example, does one begin their argument via reference to Moshe Rosen's Jews for Jesus movement, which was founded in 1973 and posits Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah, or do they begin with Maimonides? And I think we all know what the answer to that probably is, right? So now with a little bit of the background of the book in mind, I'll just briefly, this is the table of contents. So this is how I structured the book. Like I said, there's a logical order to this, at least I tried to do something like that. So I begin with the introduction, then I have this sort of setting the table, liberalism and its Enlightenment origins. Then I talk about liberalisms, then I talk about Islams, and I'll get to that point as well. Then I have my three real comparative chapters here. One, comparing the liberal and Islamic approach to the moral epistemology and rights. Second, comparing, chapter 6 compares the liberal and Islamic approaches to the role of religion in the public sphere. And chapter 7, comparing liberal and Islamic approaches to the law. And then chapter 8 sort of offers a communitarian alternative for modern Islamic societies. This is sort of like my transitioning chapter, perhaps another book in the future, maybe, we'll see. And then chapter 9 is a conclusion, followed by the index. So, 9 chapters, not too many, not too few. I think it's a good number to shoot for when writing a book that's about 95 to 100,000 words. So it worked for me here, and this formula will probably be used again in the future. All right, so now I'm going to basically talk briefly about each specific chapter, and then I'll, when I get done here in hopefully half an hour or so, I'll open the floor to any further questions. So when you read the actual book, basically what I'm explaining here today is the sort of the very short, the elevator pitch version, if you will, of each chapter. I'm not going to go into too much specific detail here for the sake of time and for the sake of everyone's sanity. But if you do have some free time and the patience to read some of the more technical claims, then feel free to do so, and that's what the book is for. But this will give you a nice sort of summary of what basically is going to happen in each chapter. Okay, so chapter 2. It's titled Setting the Table, Liberalism and its Enlightenment Origins. This chapter sets some of the necessary groundwork for argumentation that will transpire in the forthcoming chapters. This chapter argued that liberalism is in fact deeply rooted in Enlightenment and in the Enlightenment ethos, which is a Western and non-Islamic phenomenon, right? While early Enlightenment thinkers were not necessarily liberal, one does indeed see a steady move towards liberalism during the 18th century. and into the era of the French and American revolutions. During this time, one sees the emergence of newly constructed concerns with universal human rights and national rights as we move further along in the development of international legal scholarship. Okay, secularism is a development that is connected to the rejection of the church's authority over worldly affairs, and the rise of modern scientific inquiry. I emphasize in the chapter the secularization of society and the internalization of secular beliefs, however, should not be understood as the same. A good deal of evidence shows that the vast majority of people today still hold strong personal beliefs in the paranormal and the supernatural. I referenced Jason Josephson Storm's really excellent book that talks about this in more detail. I highly recommend reading that, by the way. It's really interesting work. This discrepancy between the societal norms and individual beliefs has caused tension and uneasiness amongst many peoples. So while the process of secularization is not uniform and linear by any means, it is something that liberalism in many ways is dependent upon. Finally, a century before nation states were ever created, I make a point that at this point is just commonly understood, but it's good to re-highlight, I guess, briefly, that Islam was not only a part of Europe, but served as Europe's necessary other, a development that many social theorists have argued is necessary for the formation of the group identity of what Europe is today, right? Well, it might not be easy for the average person. I tell this to my students a lot. Well, it might not be easy for the average European or American to say what Europeans or Americans actually are. What does it mean to be an American? It's actually much easier, we find, to say what we are not, right? And for the vast majority of people living in Europe, what they are not is Muslim, right? So this is sort of the Joseph Massad argument, and I'm sure many of you probably already read that book. And I just briefly referenced that basic claim here. So this is sort of like setting the table as we move a little bit more into the next sections here. So chapter 3 is where I sort of really break down liberalism, and this chapter gets sort of technical, and I think this chapter might be a little bit difficult for those who don't have a background in this topic. So you might want to have some Rawls with you while you go through this chapter if you haven't read it before. Okay, so chapter 3 sought to give further credence to Charles Taylor's more general argument that liberalism, despite its claims to be a neutral arbiter, ultimately is nonetheless yet another conception of the good. Right? Daniel Weinstock nicely analyzed Taylor's basic position, commenting that Taylor saw societies to protect individual rights so that people can lead lives according to their own lights, as embodying, at minimum, quote, a partially historically, culturally situated conception of the good, rather than somehow standing, quote unquote, above such conceptions. Most of liberalism's contemporary critics have argued that liberalism is something that cannot be understood only in its limited political sense, right? So we're talking about political liberalism, right? Any iteration of liberalism ultimately is, in fact, at some levels, a transformative project. All forms of liberalism possess an undeniably transformative character that seeks to maximize autonomous individual agency at some level, which is an essential feature of Joseph Raz's understanding of perfectionist liberalism. So I'm absolutely not suggesting that political liberalism and comprehensive or Enlightenment liberalism are the same. They certainly are not, but they do, in my opinion, at least share an undeniable familial relation. The chapter aimed to show that efforts to fully divorce the two, as Rawlsians have tried to do, I don't think is feasible. If political liberalism, as Rawls suggests and his followers, is genuinely not contingent upon any particular comprehensive doctrine, then perhaps there is more room for malleability between political liberalism and Islam. On the other hand, if political liberalism, even if it seeks to claim otherwise, remains rooted within the standard Enlightenment liberal conception of the good life, as this chapter aimed to show, then finding a genuine overlapping consensus between the two beyond a tenuous modus vivendi at best becomes even more challenging. Okay, so while pragmatic compromises of this nature have often been essential for the success of liberal toleration-oriented discourses, and liberalism more generally, nonetheless, such accounts fail to account for the moral appeal of genuine toleration, something that liberalism supposedly takes seriously. Inherent within Rawls's iteration of political liberalism, there's a not so subtle recognition of what is and what is not acceptable in terms of certain comprehensive doctrines. This ultimately presupposes a certain latent conception of the good, or at least in my assessment, a conception of the not good, which itself I do not believe can be properly understood or even articulated without at least some rudimentary conception of the good. All right. So even if one tries to argue that his declaration is merely a condemnation of what is wrong rather than a positive affirmation of any particular comprehensive doctrine, Rawls's claim that political liberalism is a neutral arbiter regarding competing conceptions of the good and metaphysical truth claims, in my opinion, does remain dubious. Rawls's reasonableness corollary is a prerequisite for public discourse remains an unresolved and potentially problematic issue, potentially excludes many lines of religious-rooted reasoning, or even certain religious discourses more generally altogether a priori. While Sam Huntington may have made many objectionable points in his clash of civilization argument, one thing that he does seem accurate in is his depiction of the West's continued misguided belief in the universality of its values and political systems regarding of a society's pre-existent religious beliefs or local customs. So while in the Trump era, the West seemed to have moved more towards supporting pliant authoritarian regimes rather than actually promoting genuine democratization in the Middle East, Western nation states, including the United States, even under Trump, still seem quite interested in pushing the quote unquote universal liberal social and economic norms to one degree or another, even if they didn't really mean it, right? For Huntington, this type of behavior, this kind of like these mixed signals will only further antagonize other civilizations and lead to more conflict. And on this particular point, I really think he is spot on, right? So that sort of sets the table. So basically, the argument is, to summarize this chapter, Enlightenment liberalism and political liberalism are not the same, but I think that they do share a very close relationship, and we shouldn't discount that when moving forward. And this leads to the next chapter, chapter 4, which is Islam's, right? And this chapter was fun for me to write. I really enjoyed writing this particular. So chapter 3 was very tedious and technical. I enjoyed it, but it was like a real labor. Chapter 4, on the other hand, was something that I just found to be fascinating as I was writing. And I hope this makes sense to you guys, because I think this is an important question. So I argue here at the beginning of the chapter, if we are to talk about liberalisms, plural, then we're also obliged to engage in a discussion about this idea of Islam or Islams, right? As well, right? We can't just talk about liberalism as a multifaceted discourse and ignore the Islam part, right? So the question of what is Islam has become increasingly salient in recent decades, and has been addressed by a litany of scholars, including most recently Muhammad Suleiman, Shahab Ahmed, Talal Assad has spent a career talking about this, Ovamir Anjum, Michael Gilsonan, and Abu Hamid El-Zain, just to name a few. Okay, so there's a long list of people who've talked about this in the last 50 years. Basically their questions sort of break down to, can a conclusive, essentialized account of Islam as a single discursive meta tradition be offered? I do not think it can. A multiplicity of interpretations, sects, and dogmas have emerged over the centuries that only the most rigid sectarian partisan would deny still fall somewhere within the broader umbrella that is Islam. As a matter of fact, a wide range of iconic Islamic scholars over the centuries, including Imam Shafi, Ibn Qutayba, Ghazali, and Ibn Taymiyyah, all understood scholarly disagreement or ikhtilaf as a mercy and a blessing from God, right? So if a unified single account of Islam is not feasible, is this entire project itself incoherent? I do not think this is the case either. This chapter contends that while a unified, conclusive, discursive account of Islam with the capital I may be difficult to provide, it is plausible to offer a coherent account of Islam, once again with the capital I, that will be palatable to most readers. This is pretty much what the last chapter sought to do in its discussion of liberalism, right? This seems to be the case actually with any expansive ideology or system of belief. While offering a conclusive account may never really be possible, one may still be able to offer one that is coherent and plausible. Plausibility, however, does not speak for itself, and it needs to be backed with sound argumentation, right? So a large part of Andrew March's method is plausibility, right? So we're trying to show that this claim I'm making is plausible. You don't have to necessarily buy it, but the idea is in the end, you'll say it, well, I can see that argument. That makes some sense, right? So this is sort of how I understand plausibility, right? It's not completely just crazy, right? Okay, so to help bolster the plausibility of my claims, right? This chapter engaged with Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblances and the idea of prototype theory, which first emerged within the field of cognitive science a few decades ago. So with this in mind, the burden of proof is much lower for demonstrating that a plausible and coherent ontology of Islam is possible, as opposed to a definitive one where the bar is significantly higher, if not impossible altogether to meet. Drawing from the likes of Talal Assad, I argue that one can understand Islam sort of like a giant web. You have primary sources and beliefs that are universally assented to by just about any Muslim, right? Followed by that, you have the canonical, legal, and scholarly texts, the Muwatta, Imam Shafi's Risala, etc. Following this secondary level, you have tertiary commentaries and developments by later scholars on these aforementioned canonical discourse-setting works that is well accompanied by certain practices, right? While these commentaries and developments are extremely valuable, nonetheless, they are in the end less rudimentary to the overall discourse than the text that they analyze, right? And then these tertiary commentaries have their own commentaries, so forth and so on. And the web sort of gets bigger and looser as we go further down, right? So nonetheless, just because these later works are situated more on the periphery of the web does not mean that they do not have a place on the web. The point here is really that if you remove these threads from further down the web, you do not necessarily destroy the tradition, right? So you don't destroy the web per se if you remove the threads in the periphery. The web, however, will become inflexible and exclusionary, and ultimately will fail then to capture the rich tapestry that is the broader Islamic tradition if too many of these strings are removed. These examples sort of also resonate with Prototype's theories appeals to an ideal exemplar or by possession of a sufficient number of typical features of classes alluded to by earlier scholars. If enough of these cases can be brought to bear with a general sense of agreement amongst Muslims, texts and practices that are widely assented to be prototypical of Islam more generally as a discursive tradition, then one, in my opinion, has the necessary ingredients to explain a discourse such as Islam as a more generalizable metacategory that remains flexible but nonetheless has meaningful content and tangibility. So, if you remove the strings on the inside of the web, right, the whole web sort of breaks down. But if you pull off the strings on the outside of the web will remain, right? So it's just a matter of the question, in my opinion, is how big of a web does one want to create? This is the real question, and this is the question that I am not whatsoever qualified to answer. But I think this is something that scholars to this day can continue to debate and discuss, right? So a web that is too big potentially waters it down to where Islam really does become just as incoherent as someone like Abu Hamid al-Zain claimed it was in 1977, whereas a web that is too limited and too small fails to capture for important movements within Islam. So this is something that scholars continue to discuss. I think my position is pretty similar to Tal al-Assad and Over Anjum's, to be honest, on this matter. So if you read their arguments, you'll probably see something similar to what I'm trying to argue, probably far less articulate than these two fantastic scholars. But this is where I sort of take my inspiration from in this section, okay? Whew. So now we get to the comparative section, right? So I've sort of laid out the groundwork for what is Islam, what is liberalism, is liberalisms, etc. So we move on here to comparing the liberal and Islamic approaches to moral epistemology and human rights, okay? So this gets pretty technical, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible here. The chapter first engages with questions related to Islam and liberalism's moral epistemologies, okay? It frames its argument around a thought specifically of John Locke, which serves really as the fulcrum for comparative analysis. Questions that are explored in this section include: how do societies come to understand morality, and what sources are engaged with when crafting localized and universal moralities? I would like to begin by pointing out that Locke was a notoriously difficult thinker to pin down on many key issues, especially those related to moral law and natural rights. Locke's moral theory, as outlined in his essay concerning human understanding, presents many formidable challenges for even his most skilled professional readers. Catherine Wilson eloquently lays down some of these problems, noting that, quote, and this is her words, and I use this quote in the book because I really liked it. This sort of illustrates how complicated Locke was. Depending on where in the essay concerning human understanding one looks, the content of morality appears to depend on the Bible, or on the requisites of our fellows, or on the personal needs and interests, or our knowledge of moral principles in turn seems to depend on a priori reflection, or social learning, religious instruction, and the analysis of terms and sentences, right? Locke's generous attempts to accommodate every moral intuition makes it difficult to really characterize his doctrines in standard terms, end quote. So I think that pretty much sums it up there. However, I offer my own efforts in this chapter to lay out, once again, a plausible portrayal of Locke's basic moral epistemological positions. Okay, so Locke's position does not begin with rights per se, but it does hinge upon the obligation of everybody to obey the law of nature, because man represented the divine workmanship of God. This of course, is a speculative argument, in my opinion, that begs the question, where does God explicitly iterate these rights that Locke refers to? The answer is that God did not explicitly iterate these rights. He iterated certain laws to follow that can be derived from the Bible, but for Locke, it appears that no such explicit textual or revealed source can be pointed to specifically for rights. Why? This is because natural rights derive from natural law, which itself exists within nature and is readily recognizable by man via his own rational faculties. It's also important to note that for Locke, divine law and natural law were not at odds. How was he able to ensure this? The answer is rather straightforward. Locke simply interpreted natural law in a way that was consistent with biblical teachings. At the same time, however, Locke also made biblical teachings fit within a liberal understanding of the world. According to B. Q. Park, who is a fantastic scholar, I hope you all have had a chance to read him, uh, Locke allowed for the liberal worldview to re-articulate Christianity in what he calls, quote, standard liberal idioms. And he achieved this by turning Christianity into a reasonable doctrine, by stripping it of its theological mysteries, reducing its highly complex ethic to a simplified morality of bourgeois reciprocity, and turning things like churches into voluntary associations, etc., etc. In essence, Locke made his biblical scriptural interpretations fit within his own iteration of natural law, which which Park himself understands as, like I said, the simplified morality of bourgeoisie reciprocity, with a heavy emphasis on property rights. This is what allowed for Locke's theory to accommodate both divine law and natural law at the same time. Now, briefly summarizing the link between God, the law of nature, and how the law of nature comes to be understood by man, and Locke's depiction of how we come to acquire ethical truths, it goes something like this. God, wait, hold on a second. I'm losing my spot. I gotta check my notes. This is so technical here. God, who himself is constrained regarding certain moral truths, which exist independent of his will, according to Locke, creates the law of nature. Okay, with the aforementioned restraints in mind, and man eventually comes to understand this law of nature via reason. Okay, such laws are understood via antecedent and never innate imprint, even though we all do possess certain hardwired instincts for other things, such as base physiological drives and urges. Example of these for Locke include our desires for food, water, the avoidance of pain, right? He also believed that we have a natural inclination to seek knowledge, and they're all like, people without disabilities and without other mental problems possess the capacity to learn, right? This understanding is quite different from the most widely held positions on Islam, how individuals come to understand morality. Within Islam, all knowledge is rooted in this fundamental notion of God's oneness, understood as Tawheed. Goodness does not exist outside Allah's will, nor is Allah constrained by anything independent of whatever restrictions he may choose to place on himself, which he, of course, always has the ability to overcome. Even those few scholars who still cling to certain aspects of Mu'tazilite rationalism rarely, if ever, promote their school's earlier position, which explicitly held that God's will is constrained by external moral prerequisites. This is a position that lost its currency around 1,000 years ago. The late 20th century Palestinian American philosopher, the great Ismail al-Faruqi, argued that Tawhid rests on three core methodological principles. First, rejection of all that which does not correspond with reality. Second, the denial of ultimate contradictions. And third, openness to new and or contrary evidence. We can see that authentic Tawhid necessitated both rational, empirical observations, along with the recognition of God's divine unity. For people like Faruqi, the two cannot be separated. The second part of this chapter, so that was sort of the first part of the chapter. Second part of the chapter then looks at the foundations of the universal rights as understood within the liberal and Islamic moral universes, and shows that the two discourses have some convergence but some departures. Once again, there's a heavy focus on Locke here. Regarding the modern notion of rights, I quote Alistair McIntyre, who points out that from a purely linguistic perspective, there doesn't exist any proper translation from any of the medieval languages, what we would consider today a modern right. McIntyre comments that the concept lacks any means of expression in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Arabic, classical or medieval, before about 1400, let alone in Old English or in Japanese, as late as the mid-19th century, right? A similar assessment regarding the lack of a concrete notion of human rights that exists in antiquity was also expressed by Benjamin Constant, who believed that one of the unique contributions of the French Revolution was its firm establishment of the idea of the universal rights of men. Prior to the French Revolution, no such concept was really taken seriously by most people. according to Constant. Islam and liberalism are at one level both concerned about the individual. However, the way in which these concerns are articulated differs radically. The great scholar Kamali asserts that Islam's primary focus is on the individual, but in the sense that it inspires the believer to faith and instills him in the qualities of being trustworthy and righteous. This is to suggest that Islam is more deeply concerned with the individual's soul and spiritual well-being than it necessarily is with their worldly rights and freedoms. Though, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. It is concerned with these two as well. But if push comes to shove, I would argue that the spiritual well-being takes precedence to all, and I think that's not overly controversial to state. Though I don't want people to think that I'm saying the two are in conflict, because I don't think that's the case. I think in most cases they operate in tandem to some degree. I quote Abdulaziz Sachedina, another scholar who is I got to meet him in Turkey a couple years ago, and he's just an amazing man. Just if you've ever met him, he's just a really powerful presence. He reminds us that the language of the Islamic juridical tradition is primarily the language of responsibilities and obligations, rather than of rights and liberties. And that's a direct quote. So within the liberal discourse, the understanding of the individual is one steeped in a somewhat expansive notion of basic liberties and rights. Liberalism really does not concern itself with intrinsic qualities such as trustworthiness and righteousness as moral ends in of themselves, right? The emphasis on responsibilities and obligations noted by Sachedina, in my opinion, differs markedly from the liberal juridical and constitutional tradition, which really does prioritize rights and liberties in the dunyawi sense. All right. So that leads us to chapter 6, which is a chapter that is important for the sake of this book, but it's also sort of is where I'm developing this next book possible idea about public reason in Islam. And maybe I could talk a little bit more about it at the very end, but let me talk about this here. I appreciate you all sticking with me so far. I know this has been sort of long and technical, but I've only got a couple more slides. Okay, so this chapter looks at a few different approaches that are representative of the mainstream within the broader liberal public reason discourse, okay? Specifically, it critically engages with the arguments, once again, of Rawls, but this time also Habermas and Jonathan Kwong. Some have argued that political liberalism thus far has only really sought to address liberal or fundamentalist religious actors, and has actually paid insufficient attention to mainstream traditionalist religious actors, which make up a significant portion of believers across all religious discourses. The main claim being promoted in this chapter that appeals to liberal public reason run into some problems when it comes to satisfying the need of traditionalist Muslim actors who seek to fully engage in public discursive space. While there's been a litany of scholarship on liberal approaches to public reason since Rawls's work has first come out in the 1970s, the opposite is true regarding non-liberal approach to public reason, right? This chapter sought to engage with some of the limitations regarding what liberal public reason can offer those worldviews that are rooted in Islamic socio-political mindset. It did not aim to show that liberal and Islamic conceptions of public reason are hopelessly in conflict at all times. Liberal public reason can potentially be operationalized within various domains within the broader Islamic social discursive sphere within certain parameters. For example, Muhammad Fadl, who spoke here a couple times as well, has recently argued that within the realm of non-ideal theory, specifically regarding how Islamic judges operationalize public reasoning when applying Islamic law, quote, Rawls' idea of public reason can play an important role in guiding how public reason-minded judges should apply Islamic law when the rules of their legal system require them to do so, end quote. I think this is accurate to a large extent. In certain cases, public reason-minded judges can find ways to creatively balance obligatory religious prerequisites with the basic standards of liberal public reason in a way that remains within the fold of Islamic legal thinking if done correctly. However, by Fadl's own account, public reason-minded judges are only one type of judge. They are not necessarily the default or the only correct type of judge. It is questionable as to whether or not most Islamic judges in practice, since we're still talking at the level of non-ideal theory, operate in a Rawlsian public reason-minded manner when applying law. While public reason obviously plays a role in shaping a public reason-minded judge's decisions, there are undeniably other doctrinal factors that will tint any Islamic judge's reasoning and decision-making processes as well. And these reasons may, in times, run afoul of Rawlsian public reason demands. The same logic can be extended to understanding how individuals engage in public reason more generally. I feel Fadl sort of downplays this in his analysis. In the end, it seems that his iteration of an overlapping consensus between Islam and non-ideal theory is based upon a certain idealized version of Islam, and perhaps even an idealized version of non-ideal theory as well. The biggest problem with his claims here is that they minimize the deeper problem posed by the fact that, by his own admission, there cannot be a political or legal space for Islamic law in a liberal democracy. It involves his ideal theory, except to the extent that Islam and Islamic law may play a legitimate role in the personal and associational lives of Muslim citizens of a well-ordered society. It's important to remember that non-ideal theory, however, is rooted in an ideal theory, and that if, as according to Fadl, it, quote, in his own words, seems obvious that Rawls's ideal theory is not compatible with traditional Islamic values and beliefs, then one is already beginning, in my opinion, with a shaky foundation for conceptualizing the compatibility of Islam within non-ideal theories as well. Fadl's own approach to this matter hinges upon Muslims endorsing what he calls conceptions of Islam that are reasonable from a Rawlsian perspective, which is something that this chapter sought to show, and you have to read further to find out what I argued more specifically, may be a little bit more problematic than it sounds when looking really closely at what counts as reasonable and how traditional interpretations of Islam fit within the standard liberal understanding of reasonableness. So that discussion is buried somewhere in chapter 6. If you want to read more about that, feel free to. And like I said, I think there's a real need to theorize about public reason in non-liberal societies, because I don't think this has really been done. And that I continue to do my preliminary reading on this as I'm working on this, what hopefully will be another book some point way down the road. I just haven't seen anybody really theorize about public reason outside of liberal societies. And I think hopefully this next book of mine will be a unique and important contribution, inshallah. Okay, we just got a couple more to go here and then we'll be done. And I'll open the floor to whatever questions you guys got. And I hope you have a few. Chapter 7, I'll be a little bit shorter here. This chapter, comparing liberal and Islamic approaches to law, this chapter explored the similarities and differences between Islamic and liberal conceptions of law. It first offers a brief outline of oh my goodness, how fatwa function within substantive Islamic law, touching upon this idea of this closing of the gates of ijtihad popularized by later Orientalist scholars. It then articulates how Western liberal legal discourses differ from Islamic liberal discourses in terms of purpose and scope. Finally, the chapter explores similarities and differences between the American legal system and classic Islamic legal thought regarding moral prerequisites for the admissibility of witness testimony in a court of law. The overarching argument of this chapter aims to promote is that liberal conceptions of law at one level are freer than Islamic law. This is because of the greater flexibility that liberal legal conceptions have regarding their commitment to their own foundational sources rooted in human reason and not revelation, meaning they're more malleable and subject to change. However, at the same time, I contend that liberal legal theory is far more limited in scope and is less concerned with directly engaging with political and or moral questions than Islamic law, or that at least seeks to address the questions in a different way by different means. Okay, this point about Islam's wider scope was the basic argument of the great scholar N.J. Coulson, who argued that Sharia has in fact a much wider scope and purpose than what he calls a simple legal system in the Western sense of the term. He states that, quote, jurisprudence or fiqh not only regulates in meticulous detail the ritual practices of faith and matters which could be classified such as medical hygiene or social etiquette or legal treaties, indeed invariably deal with these topics first. It is also a composite of science of law and morality, and whose exponents are the guardians of the Islamic conscience, okay, end quote. Many questions liberal law seeks to punt back to other political actors and government body. Islamic law, at least in principle, seeks to directly confront by its Sharia-rooted discursive framework. This chapter concludes that when properly actualized in Islamic legal discourse will never completely absolve itself from considering questions of goodness or soundness when offering a legal decision. When taking this matter seriously, it means that Islamic law has certain restrictions that are not present within liberal positive law from the start. This is the case even in Islamic courts. Justice is an explicitly divinely ordained requirement in the Islamic court. While the context-specific iterations of liberal positive law have their own foundational sources, such as secular constitutions or man-made bills of rights, these foundational sources are inherently malleable, as I suggested earlier, and subject to change. I quote at the end of this chapter Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes at the beginning of the 20th century, really important Supreme Court justice, commenting in the famous Southern Pacific Company versus Jensen case that, quote, the common law is not a brooding omnipresence in the sky, end quote. Rather, it is, quote, the articulate voice of some sovereign or quasi-sovereign that can be identified. It seems clear that in Holmes' assessment, there's no room for God when articulating or even thinking about modern common law. In his words, common law, quote, is always the law of some state, which means that it is always, once again, law made by man for man. The Islamic legal approach is simply no longer Islamic and becomes little more than a historical artifact when its foundational sources are no longer taken seriously. Or to put it more bluntly, borrowing from Holmes' own words, Islamic law can never be fully and properly conceptualized without recognizing a brooding omnipresence in the sky. And finally, the eighth chapter is the last content chapter. It's about communitarian alternative. So while I hope after the first 7 chapters, the readers feel that they have thus far gained some benefit from this work, I think that it's important to offer something positive, right? So I sort of offer a critique in many ways. Now, what is the alternative? Well, I think it's important to look at a mode of discourse, like I said, that has more possibilities with which to conceptualize Islam within. Okay, if one is to offer what amounts to mostly critique, as I said just a minute ago, got to try to offer something positive in this place. And I think this is good advice for most scholars. Anybody can sit there and critique something, but I don't want to really hear it unless you can actually offer something in place of what you're critiquing. So I tried to do that here. I didn't want to take too much time because I had a 90,000 word limit. I was already pretty close to it, but I think I opened the door to further inquiry on this matter. So the concluding body chapter introduces the possibility of what is widely understood as communitarianism as a more suitable alternative discourse for rethinking novel forms of Islamic social and political organization in the 21st century. This chapter first offered a working definition of community, followed by a working definition of communitarianism. It then went on to lay out the main communitarian critiques of Rawls's original positions, as well as the communitarian Islamic contentions that secular liberal individualism ultimately are self-defeating enterprises. The final part of this chapter looked in greater detail as to what virtue ethics can potentially offer for novel conceptions of Islamic modes of social and political organization. The ultimate aim of this chapter was to show that communitarian discourses offer more possibilities for meaningful engagement with Islam than does comprehensive or political liberalism. It sought to open the door to further scholarly inquiry and engagement between Islamic and communitarian discourses. A successful Islamic polity is dependent upon some shared notion of Islamic moral agency that is rooted in Quranic values. In the end, moral agency is developed as a communal value in any society, religious, secular, or otherwise, only when people actively participate in civil society, something that, as we all know, sadly, is sorely lacking in much of today's Muslim world, in which autocrats either create false civil societies that aim to mimic authentic civil societies in external form but not internal content, or they just cut straight to the chase and stifle it altogether. The lessons are to be drawn from what is happening both in the US and the EU as a result of failed neoliberal social and economic policies, along with useful insights offered by communitarian-oriented scholars, offer, in my opinion, valuable food for thought for offering novel conceptions of Islamic political and civil society. The rise of radical individualism, which in recent times has morphed into full-blown selfish egoism and a complete lack of regard for the well-being of others, is perhaps illustrated by the absurd politicization of mask wearing that has emerged during the COVID-19 crisis in the United States. It is a challenge that communitarian theorizing may be better suited to address. Nonetheless, since morality ultimately is something developed within the individual, in the end, the final decision to embrace and operationalize moral agency remains a uniquely individual choice. However, this process of coming to terms with moral agency and moral autonomy is one that is intimately connected to one's communal settings. A society that prioritizes positive communal bonds is bound to produce a different moral agent and a different public conceptualization of moral agency than one that does not. The prioritization of communal bonds does not necessitate denigrating into the politics of sectarianism or exclusion either. Drawing from Islam's historical moral resources, to borrow one of Wael Halak's favorite phrases, further scholarship should aim to create models of political discourse in which the Islamic part of Islamic societies remains at the forefront and which at the same time offer reasonable accommodations for non-Muslim citizens to participate in social political practices and enjoy a maximum range of liberties and freedoms. This is sort of what I'm trying to articulate in this new book idea about Islamic public reason. In my opinion, this is the only way to ensure social harmony and political stability in a world in which moral pluralism is an undeniable fact, and it will probably only further become further pluralistic, if anything, right? Which finally gets us to our conclusion, and I conclude with perhaps the greatest, a picture from the greatest movie of all time here. Drawing from Fred Dallmeyer, what Dallmeyer argues the essence of comparative political theorizing ought to do. This work aimed to rekindle the elan endemic to political philosophy by showing how relevant this discussion on Islam and liberalism still is today, with the hope that it would open new doors for novel lines of inquiry that can be further developed by a new generation of scholars. It did so by engaging with the claims of different authors and texts on their own terms as best as I could, with the hope that readers would be able to judge for themselves where the congruencies between Islam and liberalism can be found and how meaningful these congruencies are. Obviously, there were many different ways to approach this project. However, the main goal of this work was to present all material and arguments in a fair-minded and reasonable manner that would benefit readers coming from a wide range of disciplinary backgrounds and levels of professional expertise. This book was also written as a partial rejoinder to the recent wave of what can only be described as uninformed nonsense coming from a variety of voices representing both sides. Those interested in comparing and contrasting Islam and liberalism, sadly, often seem more interested in pushing an agenda than anything else. With relatively few exceptions, scholarly rigor generally is eschewed in favor of catchphrases and gross generalizations. On one side, there's nonsense coming from classically trained or people that aren't even properly trained, but they think they're Muslim scholars, as well as proponents of Islamic models of social organizations who couldn't even tell you who John Rawls or Judith Shklar were, but nonetheless have the utmost confidence that they know exactly what liberalism really is all about, right? This intuitive knowledge of liberalism, which they obviously don't really have. Many of these voices have reduced an expansive discourse to gripes about external policy manifestations on hot-button social and economic issues that ironically more often are socialist than liberal. On the other hand, there's an equally voluminous amount of nonsense coming from partisan, Western-educated liberal voices. Many of these voices couldn't tell you the difference between a mutaghayirat or a thawabit injunction, but without hesitation will tell you exactly who Quran 951, the so-called sword verse, really applies to. Once again, it's intuitive knowledge. It isn't really there, but they think they have. We're all familiar with certain figures in politics and the media doing things like this. This even happens in academic settings, most often in debates related to democratic transitions in developing countries. These are the people who often reduce authoritarianism and corruption in the Muslim world to spurious cultural claims based on miscontextualized references, cherry-picked from Quran translations. This conclusion chapter, in the way it was structured, it first recounts three undercurrents that permeated this work, okay? One, the differences in how Islam and liberalism thus far have understood the interaction between the dini and the dunyawi, with a lot of reference to Rushayn Abbasi's really wonderful article on this. It came out last year, I believe. Two, how alien the notion of secularism as a construct, secularism, right? Not the secular, but secularism historically has been from the Islamic mindset and even the Arabic language more generally. And three, the inextricability of Enlightenment liberalism from political liberalism. It then goes on to briefly articulate some of the practical real-world implications of rushing liberal reforms on illiberal societies, with a brief touch upon the case of Saudi Arabia. It closes with an appeal to toleration and mutual respect, constructs that are readily present within both Islam and liberalism, as this indeed is the only way for all of us to maximize our own security and collective happiness in this world. Further fine-tuning what toleration actually means, what its limits are, and how it can actually be realized will need to be further dissected by scholars and policymakers. However, in the meantime, at the individual level at least, we must take it upon ourselves to further explore and engage with the notions of toleration and pluralism that are in fact inherent within our own self-subscribed comprehensive and political doctrines. In the end, moral progress is ultimately made at the individual level, and this begins by recognizing everyone's inherent moral worth. It means treating all people, so long as they're not openly trying to harm you, with basic respect and decency. This certainly is how John Rawls would have had it. There's ample evidence within primary and secondary Islamic sources that this would have been the position of our Prophet Muhammad, Peace and blessings be upon him as well. Allahu alam. Thank you all. I literally talked for almost